I so appreciate you being here for another Todd Talk. We take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So, we've been talking about executive functioning skills. And executive functioning skills are those skills that we want our students to possess in order to be successful in the classroom. And these are things like planning, time management, and organization. They are things like metacognition and your working memory. These are things like your focus or attention. It also comes down to your grit or perseverance. And so we're going to talk about that in today's TED Talk. How do we develop perseverance and grit in our students to allow them not just to do the work, but to complete the work, to finish it off, to go through the finish line rather than stopping at the finish line. Before we get started on that, however, I'm going to have you do an activity for 2 minutes. So I'm going to give you a brain teaser and I'm going to leave it up for 2 minutes and I'll have a timer. And then I'd like you to try to solve it. And then we'll talk about it once the 2 minutes is up. So here's the brain teaser. You see that this car is covering one of the spots and you have these other numbers near it. So you have to try to determine what is the number that the car is covering. What is the number that would go in that spot? So I'll start a timer right now and then you can try to figure that out. So, what is your answer for this brain teaser? Let me ask you this. Would it be a little bit easier if I flipped the image like this? Of course, when you see this, it becomes very obvious what the answer is. You might have arrived at that, you might not have. But the real question I want to ask is this. During the 2 minutes that I gave you to work on this activity, did you work the entire 2 minutes? Or did you stop because you couldn't figure it out? Did you give up? Did you say, I can't do this? So what was your how did you use your 2 minutes? And did you persevere? And that's what perseverance is not giving up. When you are faced with a challenge, it's being willing to take that challenge and continue with it and to try different things, try plan A, B, C, D, whatever, but you don't give up. You continue to try. And this is a skill that we want our students to have. Grit can mean a lot of different things. So here are some of the synonyms that are associated with grit. You see there, such as character and tenacity, intensity, and having guts. And also the word perseverance comes to mind. And you can see there are all these elements with perseverance. including hard work, having endurance, having commitment, things of that nature. To clearly define what I mean by grit or perseverance, we are going to turn to an expert. So Angela Duckworth wrote a book called Grit, and it's an excellent book. And in this TED Talk, she's going to talk about what grit is and what she has found out about it.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom, and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies, asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
And so if you want to determine your own grit scale, Angela Duckworth's website, which is listed right here, you can go to that and take a 10-question survey. And this will help to determine your grittiness. And so you can, here's some of the questions that it asks, just a few of them, and how you respond to certain things. And then after answering these 10 questions as best you can, you are given a place on the grit scale, which looks like this, where on a scale from 0 to 5, you are given a score and it tells you where you place compared to others. So in this case, whoever took this grit score has a very low grit score, and 90% of Americans have more grit than them. So not great numbers. So you want to be towards the 4s and the 5s if you have grit. So if students don't have grit, then what do we do to help develop that? So one thing I did in class, just at the very beginning of the year, was I would put students in groups and I would have them do this activity. So I would take this piece of this here and I would cut it up and mix up the pieces and give them 5 minutes to complete the square. And students were working with others. And what I found, really interestingly enough, was that some students worked the entire 5 minutes, tried and solve it. Some gave up. Very few were able to finish it right away. So this is similar to the activity we did at the beginning of this Todd Talk, where I asked you to do an activity. This similar thing that I do with my students. But then what happens is it leads to conversations about why they may have given up, or why they didn't use grit, or what could have caused them to, or what could have helped them to push through. And so it leads into a very interesting discussion about grit and making them aware of what grit is and whether they have it or not, because awareness is really important. She talks about in the TED Talk about growth mindset. And this is kind of the idea between growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And you can see in the growth mindset, it's much more positive. You like the challenge. You don't see obstacles as being things in your way. You see these as things to overcome. But with a fixed mindset, there's very much a thinking of that when there's failure, that means bad. It means that if other people succeed, then you feel threatened. And so we want to get students more on this growth mindset side. We want to make sure that they are open-minded about their grit. Because if they're very closed-minded about it, if they think they don't have it, then it's going to be impossible for them to develop it. So you use growth mindset language in your classroom. You use growth mindset examples. And I'm going to give you 10 very specific strategies that you can use to help to increase the growth mindset of your students. This further belays the point that I'm trying to make, which is that if you have this growth mindset, that you believe that you can do something, like for instance, I can get smarter, okay, then that's going to lead to much higher achievement, much more possibility of higher achievement because you believe you can. And we all know the belief goes a long way. If we believe we can, like if we were to say, I'm terrible at math, I can't do it, then even if you work really hard, then your mindset is a fixed mindset and it's going to be really difficult to grow as in math because of that reason. So here are the 10 strategies that you can use in the classroom to develop perseverance and grit. Strategy number 1 is giving students more choice. And this may seem puzzling as to why this develops grit, but basically, when students are enjoy what they're doing, or they're interested in what they're doing, or they feel like they have a choice in matters, they are going to be more motivated. And motivation does have something to do with grit. Are students motivated to do what you're asking them to do? If they're motivated, they'll be much more likely to push through on something when something becomes challenging. If they're not motivated, they just need the slightest thing to give up. And so here's an example of a choice board for a project. And so students can choose one of these 6 things to do. And so they can find something that speaks to their own skills. So if they're an engineer, they might build a model. If they're very creative or artistic, they might do the children's book. If they are a verbal, very verbal communicator, the TED Talk will be very helpful. If they want to use, they want to figure out how to use different technology or techniques, they could make a movie. So there's lots of choices here for students to be able to do what you're asking them to do. And because you're giving them choices, they are much more likely to be motivated, and they're much more likely to show grit. Second strategy is students need to practice struggling. So we tell them it's okay to struggle, but do we put them in situations where they are doing this? And so what this looks like is like this, using STEM challenges. So these STEM challenges are never designed for people to complete them or to be successful at them. Design challenges are all about the thinking that they're doing and the fact that they're trying to accomplish something, and they're pushing through, and they're trying to improve it. And so you can see some STEM challenges here, like building a domino chain that incorporates 2 non-domino items. So it's a challenge. It's something that they may be successful at, they may not. But the question is not success or failure. The success is, did they push through or did they give up? Here's another one, using only 10 index cards, construct the tallest possible freestanding tower. Some students are going to be very successful with this, but it's important in the classroom when you're creating your culture that you explain success and failure is not what the point is. It's what you're willing to do with your perseverance that really matters. This can go into bigger items such as inquiry learning. Inquiry learning asks students to, the teacher or the students ask a question, and then the students investigate. They create, they discuss, and they reflect, but they're making the decisions. And they may not be successful. So a lot of inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning involves what I call a big, hairy problem, which is a problem that can't necessarily be solved. So when I have students doing Model United Nations, they're trying to solve issues such as world hunger, war, mistreatment of women, education, health. These are all really big, hairy problems that aren't going to be solved in a classroom or even at the United Nations. But they still are going to make an attempt to try to improve things. So they're not just going to say, well, we give up. We're going to let people starve to death. They're going to try to figure out a way to help. They may not be completely successful, but they're going to make things better. And so I like to have students do inquiry-based learning within problem-based learning and project-based learning and others, to whereas it's not something that can be solved necessarily, but it's still a process you're going through and you're using your grit or perseverance to push you through. A third strategy is give them opportunities and space to take risks. So what I mean by this is, again, you're creating a culture in your classroom, and I love this one right here. What's fail actually means your first attempt in learning. So failure does not mean that you are terrible or you're an awful person or whatever. Fail means it didn't work. So pick up the pieces and try it again and learn from the mistakes that you made. This is what education is all about. This is what learning is all about, is learning from our mistakes. And so the formative assessment cycle is an excellent model for this improvement. So we look at the way students are thinking, we challenge students, we say, you might want to try this to improve it, whatever, they revise, and then they continue on in this cycle. But the idea of the formative assessment cycle is that students can make mistakes. So we shouldn't be grading homework. We shouldn't be grading activities within the formative assessment cycle, because the message we send if we grade is, if you do this, you're going to get a bad grade. But if we don't use grade, we just provide feedback, this re-engagement of students. We just provide this feedback. It's going to allow them to find opportunities to improve without the fear of failing. We need to get rid of this idea of failure as being a bad thing. And so Here's another example of how we allow students to give them this space. We ask students to revise their essays. So they rarely turn in a first draft of an essay. So it's their second, third, maybe fourth draft. And you can see here's some ways that you can advise them in order to revise. But do we give students the same opportunity in math class where they have a problem, they didn't get the correct answer, and why didn't they? Can they revise their math work, their science work, their social studies work, their music, their art, whatever? So what can they do to improve or to correct their mistakes? Because I get frustrated sometimes when my daughter will say, I got this score, and I will say, well, what did you miss? And she said, well, the teacher won't hand back the test. We're not allowed to have the test because teachers are afraid that kids will copy it and it will. But what you're telling the kid is like, you missed something, but we're not going to tell you what it is, so you don't know what you're going to fix. And this is not a culture that you want to create in your classroom. You want a culture of, we encourage you to fix problems. We want you to learn. We don't want to catch you in something. The purpose is to learn, and we learn from mistakes. So allowing kids to make mistakes is a good thing. 4, don't be so quick to solve their problems. So when students are experiencing problems, we as teachers, our innate act is going to be to help them, because that's why we got into the business of teaching. We want to help children. But sometimes by helping them too much, we're actually hurting them. So for example, my younger daughter will sometimes say, how do you spell this, Dad? And my wife will immediately spell it. And I'll say, well, give her a chance to try to figure it out. Give her a chance to make some mistakes. We can provide some corrections, but give her a chance to struggle a little bit. And this is a small example of what's called productive struggle. And so we want students to, if they get some struggle, to find ways themselves to get out of this. So using their resources, asking a friend, moving on and coming back to it. Maybe things will become clear. Using prior experiences or prior knowledge. So we need to give them strategies. So when they do struggle, they can problem solve. They can troubleshoot, and they can figure out a way to get through this productive struggle. Another great place where I see productive struggle and allow it to happen is in group work. When students get into groups, I do a lot of training on what good group work looks like, but it's still, there might be some groups that aren't very successful because they're struggling with something. And sometimes I let them struggle. I only interfere when it becomes out of control or where it's causing the group to take a step back. But groups struggling with something, me coming and solving their problem is not going to help them. We need to make sure that we allow them to productively struggle so that they can learn from that. A 5th strategy is we need to show them the finish line. So if we want them to persevere, they need to know where the end comes. Could you imagine someone saying, you're going to race, I'm not tell you where it ends. You're just going to, no, we say you're running a 5K or you're running a half marathon. And so knowing where you're going to finish makes it so much easier to finish because you know there is an end in sight. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So we need to show them this finish line. And we can do this in a couple of ways. One way is by providing them with a rubric before they start the work. These are the expectations. These are what I'm looking for. These are the qualities that I'm going to be evaluating you on. You can see this is a research paper rubric where it shows them these are the 3 things I'm going to be looking at: structure, research, and content. And within those, there are additional details I'll be looking for. So if you take this finish line and you do what's on it, then your chances of success are going to be really high. And so students will know, because they won't say, what do I have to do to get an A in that class? They can say, this is what I have to do to get an A in this class. And they know what the finish line is. It also comes down to making calendars available. So I often had classroom calendars that gave kids a pacing guide. So you can see one here of a 20-day project where you should be at any given time. So if we're on day 9 and I sit down with them and what they're supposed to be doing is they should be analyzing why the book is not a good one to be teaching with, and they're not there, they're still back on day 6, or I'm sorry, day 5, then I'm going to, what has got you stuck? What can we do to unstick you? What are some things what strategies that you might try? But giving kids an idea of pace also. So saying this is going to take 10 days and this is where you should be at these times. You don't have to enforce this calendar strictly, but just know it's a loose structure or a loose a guy that helps kids to know how to pace themselves. And so if they're on day 13 and they're behind a little bit, day 11, they know they can catch up. But if they don't know what's going to happen on day 13, they don't know how far behind they are and where they can catch up. Because when a kid gets too far behind, what happens is they shut down, they stop because they figure, why bother? It also is showing them the product. So if you're asking kids to do diorama, so rather than just say, hey, do a diorama and here's the rubric, show them some examples of what this might look like. You, of course, don't want them to copy these examples, these products, but it does allow them to visualize, okay, this is what my end product might look like. It's going to look similar to this, somewhat like this. I'm not doing the rainforest. Maybe I'm doing the polar ice caps. And so mine's going to look different, but I see that there's labels here and that there's, represents the trees there and represents the animals there and so on and so forth. So this would give students a better idea of what they're working toward, what the finish line is. Number 6, build endurance. Again, if you're asking someone to go run a race, you can't expect them to go out and run 10 miles the first day if they've never trained. So the first day you say, okay, I want you to run a mile. Then after a few days, I want you to run a couple of miles, and you build up to that. You build this endurance. The same thing goes in your classroom. If you're asking kids to write for long periods of time, but they're not used to that, then they're going to get frustrated and they're going to give up and they're not going to show perseverance. So here's a schedule where we start on August 7th and our goal is to write for 3 minutes. Now keep in mind the finish line's at the top. As a class of writers, our goal is that everyone spends 25 minutes a day writing without distractions. So that's the end goal. That's the finish line. But we build up to this finish line. So you can see this is going to take several weeks in order to build up to 25 minutes. I do this with my projects. I don't give kids a month-long project right away. I may give them a day-long project or a couple of days. And then the next time it's a week, and the next time it's a couple of weeks. And we're going to build up to this longer project because if I don't, then kids are going to find it easy to give up because it just seems like so much. When I'm teaching kids public speaking, I have them start with 5-minute speeches first. The end goal is to do a 20-minute speech, like a TED Talk. But I start with 5, and then they go to 10, and then they do a 20. And this builds their stamina. And what I find is that nearly every child can get to the 20-minute speech using this method. If I just told them to do a 20-minute speech right then, there would not be much success going on. Strategy number 7. Share your own stories of grit and have students share theirs. There needs to be a space to do that. So when you have to push through something, maybe something didn't go like you thought it was going to go in the classroom, be vulnerable. Share that with them and have a space to do that. You can see this Got Grit bulletin board. And there's Post-it notes there where kids and the teacher can share stories of their grit. And so let's say you put this up there and kids put up and they were playing football and they saw the ball and they gave up on it. And if they hadn't given up on it, they might have caught it. And so that might be an example they give. Or they're reading a book and they're getting frustrated with the book. And so they stopped reading the book. And so these would be examples where they didn't use grit, or they might have examples where they did push through, where they figured out, I was fighting with my brother all the time, but I figured out a way for us to compromise and to get along. And so every once in a while, and this could be anonymous, but every once in a while, pull a couple of these grit stories and share them with the class. And so people can say, oh, I can relate to that. Or, oh, I see by pushing through what they were able to accomplish, or by giving up what they missed. And so we need to have a space to share these stories. Number 8 is help students to figure out what they can and cannot control. Sometimes students cannot control certain things. So if something happened, like they were working on something at home and there was an emergency in the family and they weren't able to do what they needed to do, they can't do anything about that. It's out of their control. And so we learn to adapt to that. So they share that story and we figure out a way to give them more time to accomplish what they want. But sometimes students also think that things are not in their control that are. And this is where that perseverance and grit comes. So I can't do this. That fixed mindset takes the control out of your hand. But if you say, I can do this if I work hard enough, then you firmly are putting the control back in your plate, and you can then use that to persevere or have grit. So you can do activities with students like this, where you show them the circle of control and what you can control and what you can't control. So you can't control predictions of the future. You can't control the weather. You can't control, when something comes up, but you can control making right decisions or asking for help, or making sure that you use different strategies if you get stuck. These are definitely things that can be controlled, and by students seeing that they can control this, it's going to be very helpful for them to develop that growth mindset. And if you don't want to just give it to them, you can give them something like this and ask them what can they control and what they can't. And what you're going to learn from students is they may think that there's things that they can control that they can't, or things that they can't control that they think they can. And that's going to spark a conversations on, that they say, I can't control my actions. Well, we know that students can control with regulation. Sure, some have more difficulty than others, but they can control their actions. And so what are some strategies for doing this? A ninth strategy is give them real life examples or concrete examples that they can say, that's an example of perseverance. So this can be done with real life people or with characters in books. So here's some examples. So J.K. Rowling had all these obstacles. She was jobless. She was divorced. She was diagnosed with clinical depression. When she turned in her first manuscript of Harry Potter, she was rejected by all these publishers. The first editor ever to work with her told her to get a day job because she wasn't going to be able to make a living at this. And yet, she is the most best-selling author in history. She did not quit. Imagine if she did quit, there would be no Harry Potter. Imagine the people that have quit, that we didn't get to experience their books because they gave up. And so this is a real life example of grit or perseverance. You could read stories like, for younger children, The Little Engine That Could is a great one. This is about, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. It's having that growth mindset that they think they can do it. And so the little engine is able to be successful because of this growth mindset. If you have older students, you can use books like The Hobbit. This is, you have Frodo on this seemingly, or actually that, but in The Hobbit, he's on, Bilbo Baggins is on this really difficult quest. And so he has to figure out how to overcome all these problems. He could have very easily said, I give up. I'm done. And then the journey ends and the story doesn't get told. But and Tolkien continues this on with the Lord of the Rings, when he has Frodo and his band of going to Mount Mordor and trying to get rid of the ring. And so these are great examples in literature of characters that do not give up. And then you can have conversation about what would happen if they did give up, because you can't imagine what it would be like if they did. You can also have them interview people, what they call grit interviews, where they find a relative or a neighbor or a friend and ask them questions like, what's the biggest achievement in your life? And then what did you have to do? What obstacles did you face? Why didn't you give up? What advice would you give to me when it comes to perseverance? So they can do these interviews so that they can learn from someone and see it happening in the real world rather than just in the classroom. The 10th one the 10th strategy to talk about is reflecting, reflecting, reflecting. Students should be reflecting. This didn't work because of that. That's how they improve with this reflection. Here's a perfect example of control versus not control. A student says, teacher gave me a C because they don't like me. That is not the truth. Teachers rarely give grades because they don't like kids. What happens is the kid doesn't understand what they can control, and so they blame something else that they cannot control. But there are certainly things that student could have done, such as work harder, or to find more resources, or to ask for help. And so we need to give students a chance to reflect upon these mistakes. And so here are some reflection questions that you might ask. So when were you at your best today? Okay. And you can do a flip on that. When weren't you your best? Number 8, what challenges did you encounter? How do you respond to those? So what now? So if things didn't go the way you wanted them to work, the next time, what do you need to do in order to use that perseverance and that grit? And you can do these reflections. You can ask them as questions like this. They can be in lots of different. So this goes back to the idea of choice. So kids can write a short letter to themselves. They can, just do like a testimonial where they confess, a confession where they're saying what went wrong, or keeping a digital diary or video journal. So these are some ways, some different ways that they can reflect. So there are 10 strategies that you can use. And keep in mind this idea that Angela Duckworth talks about in her book is that grit means that life is a marathon, not a sprint. So you may think you've accomplished what you need to accomplish, but then there's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And those people who give up never get to where they want to be. Those people who persevere more than likely are going to find a way to where they want to be. And so teaching this to students and having this culture in your class is really important. There are a couple of things to remind them of. First off, that grit doesn't happen overnight. Grit is something that is developed. You have to build this. So it may not go right this time, and you may not figure out exactly what to do next time, but you're working on it and you're developing this. You need to practice grit. So be in situations where you get to use these habits you've developed or this mindset that you've developed. But they need to be put into, and I mean, the sports field is a perfect place where or video games is the perfect place where failure is perfectly accepted. You learn from, if you are playing a video game and you mess up, you just do the level over again and you learn from the mistakes you made the first time. And I know my daughters will spend hours and hours on a level figuring out how to be successful, but they don't give up. They continue on because they're motivated, because it's something they want to be doing. Having a sense of purpose. And what I mean by this is that if they don't know what the end goal is, if they don't know what their life goals are for that matter, they don't know what to head for. So if you're a student and you don't know what you're going to do when you graduate from high school, whether it's going to college, going into a trade, getting a job immediately, whatever. If you don't know what that is, you don't know what to push toward. And so it's important that students see the long term. That's not just like the marathon versus the sprint. It's not the short-term sprint. It's the long-term marathon. And how do we get to that point? So a few reminders at the end here. Make sure you're modeling a growth mindset with your students. Use that language. Have those examples and make sure you point out this is an example of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, or that's an example of fixed mindset, which is why things didn't work. Focus on effort. Students can always work harder. Students can't become smarter necessarily. They may learn more, and they may because of their hard work, but intelligence only gets you so far. Angela Duckworth talked about that. Like what she found was the main factor was that their hard work, their effort. So we need to focus that. We can't say, well, you did so well because you're so smart. Kids can't control that. So make sure you praise them or focus on the things that they can control, because you can always control the effort that you give. A culture of failure is perfectly okay. Matter of fact, something that should be celebrated in the classroom. So, hey, colossal failure, great. What did we learn from it? Looking at colossal failures in history, there's lots of them. Or in science, some failures lead to success. So when you look at something like, penicillin, which was a mistake, but then it led to, these antibiotics that help people all, for the last 100 years or so. So learning from mistakes and realizing that mistakes are not necessarily a bad thing is a culture you want to create. Teach them how to manage their time. So any of the executive functioning skills are going to be resources towards their perseverance. So if they think things are too hard, it may be because they didn't manage their time or they weren't organized, or it might be they lost their focus. So using those executive functioning skills as resources to develop their grit is another thing that you want to stress with them. You want to make sure you plan activities where they get out of their comfort zone. Again, this is where the best learning takes place, where they are not comfortable with what they're doing, but they're willing to try because they believe that they can succeed, or they believe they can, do it. And so again, but you have to have activities where if you give them just all safe activities and they know what to do, there's no growing going on. There's no risk taking. There's no grit needed because you don't really need the grit. But this is why people love sports. This is why people climb Mount Everest, because it's there, they say. It is something that reminds them of something they could accomplish. And then lastly, the idea of reminding students that we're never trying to gain perfection. Okay, try to eliminate the word perfect from your vocabulary altogether. And to say, because if you say, oh, that's perfect, then the student doesn't have anywhere to go. But we know that things aren't perfect. There's always something. It doesn't mean that you have to point out all its flaws. You could say, that was an excellent job. Here's something you might want to consider. So making sure that students know is that it's not about being perfect that matters, not getting it all right. It's about working towards it and showing perseverance.